Pick it up, Private, you're too slow. Keep that head down and move. We won't stop until the sun goes down.
March 1944. A Japanese officer clutched a propaganda leaflet as he died on Bougainville's muddy riverbank. 22 of his men lay scattered around him. The leaflet mocked black American soldiers as cowards who would flee at the first gunshot. He'd believed it. Now drowning in his own blood, he understood his fatal mistake. The men he'd underestimated had just taught him war's cruelest lesson. Courage has no color, only consequences. But this story doesn't start on that killing ground. It starts 6 months earlier in the Arizona desert, where America was conducting an experiment it hoped would fail. Fort Huachuca, Arizona, July 1943. The temperature hit 112 degrees by noon. Private Marcus Williams ran the obstacle course for the third time that morning, his hands bleeding through worn gloves. Behind him, Corporal Jackson yelled something about water breaks. Marcus didn't stop. He couldn't. Williams, stand down. Sergeant Thomas Lee's voice cut through the heat shimmer. Marcus hit the ground, chest heaving. Dust coated his throat. Lee walked over his shadow, offering brief mercy from the sun. "What you trying to prove, son? That I belong here, Sergeant?" Lee crouched down, his face level with Marcus's. 20 years in the Army had carved lines around his eyes. "You already belong here. You enlisted. You passed basic. You're wearing the same uniform as every other man on this base." He paused. "Question is, who you really trying to convince?" Marcus wiped blood from his palms onto his fatigues. The cotton was already stiff with dried sweat. "Saw the way Captain Morrison looked at us yesterday. Like we were gonna break the first time we saw combat. Morrison's scared." "Of what?" "Of being wrong about us. Of 30 years of believing something that ain't true." Lee stood up, offered his hand. "Come on, save some of that fire for the enemy." But the enemy wasn't just waiting across the Pacific. He was right here at Fort Huachuca. That night, the base canteen split down an invisible line, whites on one side, blacks on the other. Nobody had ordered it. Nobody had to. Private James Robinson sat with his squad watching white soldiers from the 41st Division laugh at a table 30 feet away. The smell of fried meat and cigarette smoke hung thick in the air. "They ship out next week," Robinson muttered. "Europe. They'll get ticker tape parades when they come home. And we'll get the back of the bus," Jackson added, lighting a cigarette. "If we come home." Williams pushed his tray away. The metal scraped loud against the table. "My sister wrote me. Said there was a riot in Detroit last month. White folks attacked colored neighborhoods. Police stood by and watched." "We know, Williams. We all know." Lee's voice was quiet but firm. "That's why we're here. To die for people who hate us." "No." Lee leaned forward. "To prove we're willing to. That's the price of the ticket. Always has been." Across the canteen, a white corporal from the 41st stood up loud enough for everyone to hear. "Hey, you think they'll actually send them into combat or just have them dig latrines in the rear?" His buddies laughed. The sound cut through the room like glass breaking. Lee's hand shot out, gripping Williams's wrist before he could stand. "Not here. Not now." Then when Sergeant Lee met his eyes. "When it matters. When there's no question about who we are and what we did. That's when." The 93rd Infantry Division had been training at Fort Huachuca for 18 months. 13,000 men learning jungle warfare in the desert, preparing for an enemy they'd never faced in a war that most white officers believed they weren't fit to fight. The official War Department position, though never stated publicly, was clear: black soldiers lacked the mental capacity for complex operations, the discipline for sustained combat, and the courage to stand under fire. Colonel Claude Martin knew better. He'd watched his men master tactics that white units struggled with. He'd seen them push through training that broke harder men. But he also knew what failure would mean, not just for the 93rd Division, but for every black soldier who came after. "Sir, you wanted to see me." Lieutenant Joseph Tate stood at attention in Martin's office. "Sit down, Lieutenant." Martin closed the folder on his desk. "We got our orders. Bougainville, March deployment." Tate felt his pulse quicken. "The men are ready, sir." "I know they are. Question is whether the brass believes it." Martin pulled out a cigarette, didn't light it. "There are generals in Washington betting we'll fail. praying for it even. One mistake, one moment of panic, and they'll use it to justify keeping every black unit out of combat for the rest of this war and the next. Then we won't make mistakes. Men always make mistakes in combat, Lieutenant. The question is whether we get judged by the same standard as white units, or whether our mistakes get magnified into proof of inferiority. Martin finally lit the cigarette. The match flare illuminated his face for a moment. I need you to understand something. This isn't just a military operation. This is a referendum on whether black men are fully human. That's the burden your men are carrying. And it's not fair, but it's real. Tate stood. Sir, with respect, my men don't need to prove their humanity. They just need to prove they can fight. And they will. The propaganda started before they even shipped out. Japanese intelligence had studied American racial tensions with academic precision. They knew about lynchings in the South, riots in northern cities, the legal apparatus of Jim Crow. They crafted leaflets specifically for black soldiers asking why they fought for a nation that despised them. The first batch arrived at Fort Huachuca in January 1944, dropped by a long-range reconnaissance plane that everyone pretended hadn't penetrated American airspace. Sergeant Lee found one fluttering against the barracks fence. The paper was cheap, the ink already smearing from morning dew. He read it out loud to his assembled squad. To the Negro soldiers, why are you fighting for white Americans who lynch your brothers, who deny you the vote, who force you to live as second-class citizens? The Japanese people have no quarrel with the colored races. We are fighting white imperialism just as you should be. Lay down your weapons. Your real enemy is not across the Pacific. He is the white officer giving you orders. The silence stretched. Then William spoke. They got one thing right. Every head turned. Lee's jaw tightened. We do have enemies back home. They're right about that. Williams picked up his rifle, checked the action with a metallic snap. But they made one hell of a mistake thinking that means we won't fight. See, when I kill them, I'm not just fighting for America. I'm fighting for the America that should be. The one my kids are going to grow up in. The one where this leaflet sounds crazy instead of true. Robinson nodded slowly. They think we're weak because we're oppressed. They don't understand that being oppressed makes you stronger. You learn to survive things that would break other men. Plus, Jackson added with a cold smile, I got no problem killing people who call me a coward. Seems like a service to the world, really. Lee folded the leaflet, put it in his pocket. New standing order. Anyone finds these, you bring them to me. We're going to collect every single one. And when this is over, when we've stacked up enemy bodies like cordwood, we're going to paper their headquarters with these leaflets. Show them what happens when you underestimate us. The oath went around the squad that night, spoken in whispers but absolute in conviction. Let them watch, let them doubt, then let them count their dead. February 1944, San Francisco Harbor. The transport ships gathered engines, rumbling diesel smoke into the gray morning. The 93rd Division filed aboard in columns, their faces showing nothing. They'd learned that lesson early: never show fear, never show doubt, never give anyone ammunition to use against you. Williams stood on deck as the Golden Gate Bridge passed overhead. Behind him lay everything he knew: his mother's house in Birmingham, the church where he'd been baptized, the streets where he'd learned to walk, with his eyes down and his mouth shut around white folks. Behind him lay an America that had never fully claimed him as its own. Ahead lay an enemy who'd called him inferior. Between these two judgments, he would write his answer in blood. The crossing took 3 weeks. Men got sick. The ship rolled through storms that sent equipment sliding and soldiers praying. But on day 16, something broke the monotony. Williams was on deck maintenance when he heard shouting from the galley below. He dropped his swab and ran. A crowd had formed near the mess, white sailors from the ship's crew surrounding Robinson, who held a tray of spilled food. A white petty officer stood toe-to-toe with him. "Watch where you're walking, boy." I said, "Excuse me, sir. You stepped into... You calling me a liar?" The petty officer's hand went to his belt. Williams pushed through the crowd. Lee was already there, stepping between them. "Is there a problem, petty officer? Your man here doesn't know his place." "His place is on this ship heading to combat, same as yours." Lee's voice stayed level, but something dangerous moved behind his eyes. Now, unless you want to explain to your CO why you started a fight with Army personnel, I suggest you move along. The petty officer glared but backed off. The crowd dispersed. Robinson bent to pick up the spilled food, his hands shaking not from fear, from rage, held barely in check. "Leave it," Lee said quietly. "Galley crew will handle it." That night, Williams found Robinson on deck staring at the black water rushing past the hull. The engines thrummed through the metal deck plates. "You good?" Robinson pulled out a photograph, creased, worn, soft at the edges from constant handling. His wife and daughter taken on church steps. "Her name's Sarah. She's 3. She gonna remember you." Robinson was quiet for a moment. The ship's wake glowed phosphorescent in the darkness. "If I die out there, maybe not. But if I live, if we do what we're supposed to do, maybe she grows up in a world where she doesn't have to explain why her daddy was good enough to die for his country, but not good enough to vote in it. That's a lot of pressure on a jungle island." "Yeah." Robinson tucked the photo back in his shirt pocket over his heart. "But somebody's got to carry it." In a letter to his sister dated February 23, 1944, now archived at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, Private James Robinson wrote, "They want us to fight and die for freedom we don't have at home. But we'll show them, not just the enemy, everyone watching. We'll show them what we're made of, and when this is over, things are going to change. They have to." The briefing started a week before they reached Bougainville. Lieutenant Tate gathered his platoon in the ship's hold maps spread across ammunition crates. The air down here smelled like oil and unwashed bodies. "Bougainville, largest of the Solomon Islands. We've held the southern tip since November, but the Japanese control the interior mountains' jungle swamps. Estimates say 8,000 to 10,000 enemy troops dug into defensive positions they've had years to perfect." Williams raised his hand. "Sir, what are we walking into terrain-wise?" "Hell with trees. Average temperature 95 degrees, humidity near 100%. Rain every afternoon like clockwork. The jungle is so dense you can't see 10 feet in any direction. Rivers turn into rapids without warning. And the Japanese know every trail, every ridge, every ambush point. Rules of engagement. Kill anything that's trying to kill you. The Japanese don't surrender. They fight until they're dead. Expect bonsai charges, expect night infiltration, expect booby traps." Tate looked around the hold. "Gentlemen, this is going to be the worst fighting most of you will ever experience, and you're going to do it while knowing that every mistake you make will be used as evidence against every black soldier in this war." Lee spoke up from the back. "Permission to speak freely, sir." "Granted." "Respectfully, sir, that ain't our problem. Our problem is killing Japanese soldiers. Everything else is noise." Tate smiled grimly. "You're right, Sergeant, but it's noise we can't afford to ignore." March 10th, 1944. The morning Bougainville appeared through the mist. A different kind of leaflet was making rounds through the Japanese command. Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto read it in his bunker 3 miles inland from the American perimeter. Rain drummed on the corrugated metal roof. Intelligence report: enemy reinforcements identified as 93rd American Division Negro troops. Assessment: poorly trained, low morale, expected to break under pressure. Recommended action: aggressive probing attacks to exploit weakness. Yamamoto had been fighting on Bougainville for 8 months. He'd seen American Marines who fought like demons, Australian units that never quit. But this assessment came from Tokyo, backed by their analysis of American racial problems. They couldn't all be wrong. He turned to his sergeant. "Prepare the men. We'll test these new arrivals tonight. See if the intelligence is accurate." His sergeant bowed. "Hi. It'll be good to face an easier enemy for once." Neither man could know they'd just made a fatal assumption, one that 12,000 Japanese soldiers would pay for with their lives. The landing craft hit Bougainville's black sand beach at 0630 hours. Williams was the third man out, boots hitting volcanic sand that crunched like broken glass. 50 yards ahead, the jungle waited. Something huge crashed through the undergrowth, wild pig, or worse. Birds screamed in the canopy, a sound like metal tearing. The air tasted like rot and salt, and the copper tang of adrenaline. Move off the beach!" Officers shouted commands as men scrambled for the tree line. There was no enemy fire. The Japanese were deeper inland, dug into positions they'd had years to perfect. Lee formed up his squad under a massive banyan tree, its roots spreading like gnarled fingers. Insects whined around their heads in clouds. Williams, Robinson, Jackson, you're on point. Stay alert. They own this jungle. We're just visiting. Williams checked his rifle one last time. His hands weren't shaking. That surprised him. He'd expected fear. Instead, he felt something colder, harder. Purpose. Somewhere in the green darkness ahead, an enemy waited who'd called him inferior, cowardly, unworthy. "Sergeant," he said quietly, "remember that leaflet? The one that called us cowards?" "I remember." "Let's go prove them wrong." "Not prove Williams." Lee chambered around. The bolt's metallic click was loud as a gunshot. "We're gonna make them regret ever putting that thought into words." The jungle swallowed them whole. Within 30 yards, the beach behind them vanished into green shadow. Something large moved through undergrowth to their left, 20 yards, maybe less. Williams's thumb found his safety switch. The metallic click seemed to echo. Sweat already soaked through his uniform, and the weight of his gear dragged at his shoulders. The smell hit him, decaying vegetation, stagnant water, and underneath it all, something else. The scent of death, waiting patiently. In 48 hours, the first firefight would erupt along the Tarina River. In 72 hours, Japanese command would send their first confused reports. Enemy Negro troops did not retreat. Repeat, did not retreat. Casualties mounting. But right now, in this moment, the 93rd Infantry Division simply moved through the jungle weapons. Ready eyes scanning shadows, every sense screaming danger. They were done proving themselves to America. Now they would teach the Japanese the most expensive lesson of the Pacific War. The question wasn't whether black soldiers could fight. The question was how many enemy soldiers would die learning the answer. By nightfall, the jungle would start providing that number, and it wouldn't stop counting for the next 15 months. The first shot came at 2:15 hours 2 days after landing. Williams was on watch, third rotation, when he heard it, not the gunshot, but what came before. A sound like fabric tearing. A whisper in Japanese. Then Robinson's voice, sharp and urgent from 15 feet ahead. "Contact front!" The M1. Garand barked 3 times. Someone screamed. Not Robinson, the enemy. Williams was moving before his brain caught up, dropping behind a fallen log slick with moss. His heart hammered against his ribs. The jungle exploded into noise rifles, cracking, men shouting somewhere behind them, Lee's voice cutting through the chaos. "Hold your positions. Watch your lanes." Jackson left flank. Williams couldn't see anything. The darkness was absolute, thick as tar. He fired at muzzle flashes, at movement that might be branches or might be men. His rifle kicked against his shoulder, the smell of cordite sharp in his nostrils. Beside him, someone was praying in fragments. "Lord Jesus, Lord Jesus, Lord Jesus." The words running together like water. Then silence, absolute and sudden. Williams's ears rang. He waited, finger on the trigger, every muscle locked. 30 seconds. A minute. The jungle's night sounds slowly returned, insects, frogs. The rustle of something moving through leaves overhead. "Report," Lee's voice. "Robinson clear. Jackson clear. Williams clear." Down the line, each man calling out. 2 didn't answer. Lee moved through the darkness, checking positions. Williams heard him stop, heard the sharp intake of breath that meant one of those silences was permanent. When dawn came 3 hours later, gray light filtering through the canopy like dirty water, they found 5 Japanese soldiers dead in a rough semicircle around their position. One had made it within 10 feet of Robinson's foxhole before the bullet stopped him. His hand still gripped a bayonet. They also found Private Chen and Private First Class Thompson. Chen had taken a round through the throat. Thompson's chest was torn open, probably from a grenade. Both were 19 years old. Both had survived racism and poverty and the grinding machinery of segregation, only to die in mud on an island most Americans couldn't find on a map. Williams stared at Thompson's body. They'd played cards on the transport ship. Thompson had shown him a letter from his girl back in Chicago, read parts of it out loud, grinning. Now his eyes were open and empty, staring at nothing. First time. Lee stood beside him. Seeing someone dead numb, First time seeing someone I knew. Won't be the last. Lee knelt, closed Thompson's eyes. Chaplain will say words later. Right now we need to move these bodies back to the beach, get them processed. Then we push forward. War doesn't stop for grief. But Williams saw something in Lee's face, a tightness around the eyes, a muscle jumping in his jaw. The sergeant was 20 years older, had probably seen 100 men die, but it still cost him something. That mattered somehow. It meant they were still human despite what this place demanded. They wrapped the bodies in ponchos, carried them in rotation through the jungle. The weight of a dead man is different from any other weight. It's absolute. Final. William's shoulders ached, his hands cramped, but he didn't complain. This was the debt you paid. You carried your brothers home, or as close to home as war allowed. At the beach collection point, a white lieutenant from Division HQ checked their tags, made notes on a clipboard. He didn't look at their faces. 93rd, he asked, not looking up. Yes, sir, Lee answered. Heard you took contact last night. How'd your boys handle it? The casual dismissal in that word boys made Williams's jaw clench. Lee's voice stayed neutral. We eliminated 5 enemy combatants. No ground lost. 2 KIA, 1 wounded. The lieutenant made a note. Well, it's early days yet. Let's see how they do under sustained pressure. Lee said nothing. Williams wanted to scream. They'd just fought through a night ambush, killed the enemy, held their ground, and this officer was still waiting for them to prove something, still expecting failure, still hoping for it maybe, so his worldview could stay intact. As they walked back toward their sector, Robinson spoke quietly. We could kill 1,000 of them, and it wouldn't be enough for some people. Then we killed 2,000, Jackson said, and keep killing until the enemy runs out of men or they run out of excuses, whichever comes first. The jungle settled into a rhythm over the following days. Patrol ambush firefight, casualty, evacuation, sleep in shifts, eat cold rations, clean weapons that corroded in the humidity, wait for the next attack. The Japanese probed their lines constantly, testing learning, looking for weakness. March 15th. The Tarina River sector. Williams' squad was advancing through swamp water that reached mid-thigh, their movement slow and loud despite every attempt at stealth. The water was warm, scummy, alive with leeches that latched onto any exposed skin. Something large moved beneath the surface, and Williams didn't want to know what. Lee held up a fist. Everyone froze. Williams strained to hear over the blood pounding in his ears. Their voices, Japanese, close, maybe 50 yards ahead, somewhere beyond the wall of vegetation. Lee made hand signals, enemy position flank, right Jackson take point. They moved like they'd trained slow and deliberate. Williams felt a leech attached to his neck, ignored it. The voices grew clearer. Someone laughed. They were relaxed, not expecting contact. The ambush was textbook perfect. Jackson opened up with the bar, the heavy automatic fire ripping through the jungle. Williams and Robinson flanked left, caught 3 enemy soldiers trying to maneuver. Williams's first shot dropped one cleanly. The second took 2 rounds center mass before falling. The third raised his hands, shouting something in Japanese. "Don't shoot!" Robinson yelled. "Prisoner!" But the Japanese soldier lunged forward and Robinson fired. Instinct. Survival. The man crumpled into the water. When they checked him, they found a grenade in his handpin already pulled. He'd been trying to take them with him. Robinson stood over the body, hands shaking. I gave him a chance. I told him. He made his choice, Lee said. You made the right call. How do you know? How do you know I didn't just murder a man trying to surrender because you're alive and he'd have killed you? Lee gripped Robinson's shoulder. Listen to me. This is what they do. Fake surrenders. Booby-trapped bodies. Playing dead until you get close. They've been trained that surrender is dishonor worse than death. You give them every chance you can, but the second you see a weapon, the second you sense deception, you fire. Hesitation gets you killed. You understand? Robinson nodded slowly, but Williams saw something change in his friend's eyes, a hardness that hadn't been there before. War was carving away everything soft, leaving only the bare minimum needed to survive. They counted 23 enemy dead that day. No American casualties. The after-action report went up to division, came back with a terse acknowledgement. No commendations, no recognition. Just another day in the jungle. But something else was happening, invisible to the men on the ground, but clear in Japanese command bunkers 3 miles inland. Lieutenant Colonel Yamamoto read the casualty reports with growing confusion. The Negro troops weren't breaking. They weren't retreating. They were aggressive, disciplined, deadly. His intelligence had been catastrophically wrong. He drafted a message to Tokyo dated March 16, 1944. Previous assessment of Negro American troops inaccurate. Enemy displays combat effectiveness equal to or exceeding previous American units. Recommend revision of tactical approach. The response came back within hours. Continue pressure. All enemy forces are fundamentally weak. Increase aggression. Yamamoto stared at the message, then at the casualty list: over 300 men in 6 days. His superiors were sacrificing soldiers to preserve an ideology. He'd seen this pattern before in China and Malaya. The high command would rather lose battles than admit error. He burned the casualty report and drafted a new one, cutting the numbers in half. It wouldn't save the men who died, but it might save those still living. Sometimes survival meant lying to your own side. March 20th. Williams's platoon pushed deeper into the interior, following trails that disappeared and reappeared without logic. The jungle here was different, darker, quieter, like the island itself was holding its breath. They found evidence of recent enemy occupation: cold fire pits, discarded equipment, footprints in mud. "They're retreating," Jackson said. "Running from us." "Or drawing us into something," Lee countered. "Stay alert." They found the something 2 hours later, a natural amphitheater where the jungle opened into a clearing with high ground on 3 sides. Perfect killing ground. Lee stopped them 50 yards back. "It's a trap." "How do you know?" Williams asked. "Because it's too perfect. They want us to cross that clearing." Lee studied the terrain, his eyes moving across the ridgeline. "Robinson, you see that dead tree? Top of the ridge?" "Yes, Sergeant. Look at the branches. See how they're positioned." Williams looked closer. The branches formed a screen, natural camouflage for a machine gun nest. Once you knew to look for it, you could see the barrel's shadow. "There's probably 2 more positions we can't see," Lee said. "They're dug in, waiting for someone stupid enough to walk into that clearing." "So what do we do?" Lee smiled without humor. "We call in something they're not expecting." 20 minutes later, artillery rounds began falling on the ridgeline. The 93rd had trained extensively with indirect fire support, learned to call in coordinates with precision. The Japanese positions disappeared in eruptions of earth and shrapnel. When the barrage lifted, Lee's platoon, flanked wide, came up the ridge from an unexpected angle. They found 11 enemy soldiers dead in their bunkers, 3 wounded. One of the wounded was screaming, his legs torn open by shrapnel. The platoon medic, a quiet man named Davis from Philadelphia, moved to help him. "Don't waste supplies," a white observer from Division said. He'd been assigned to their unit supposedly to assess combat effectiveness, but everyone knew he was there to document their failures. "He's not going to make it anyway." Davis ignored him, started treating the wound. "Sir, my oath don't have an exception for enemy combatants." "I'm giving you a direct order, Corporal." "Then write me up, sir, but I'm treating him first." The observer's face went red. He opened his mouth to say something, but Lee stepped between them. "Corporal Davis is following the Geneva Convention, sir. If you have a problem with that, you can take it up with the battalion commander." They stared at each other. Finally, the observer turned away, muttering something about typical discipline problems. But Williams saw Davis's hands shake as he worked on the enemy soldier. Not from fear, from rage, barely contained. They were fighting 2 wars, and sometimes the one behind them felt more exhausting than the one ahead. The wounded Japanese soldier survived. They evacuated him with their own wounded. He never spoke, never thanked them, but his eyes tracked Davis the whole time. Williams wondered what he was thinking. Whether he'd been told black soldiers were savages less than human. Whether having his life saved by one changed anything in his mind. Probably not. People's beliefs were armored against evidence. Williams had learned that long before he put on a uniform. By the end of March, the 93rd had pushed the Japanese back 7 miles, clearing sector after sector. The casualty ratio was lopsided. For every American killed, they accounted for nearly 9 enemy soldiers. The statistics went into reports that nobody stateside would read casualties tallied in columns that meant nothing to the families grieving in Birmingham and Chicago and Oakland. But in the jungle, where truth was measured in blood and territory, everyone knew. The white Marines they relieved made comments, surprise comments, about how well the 93rd had performed. Some were genuine, some were grudging. A few were hostile, as if black competence somehow diminished their own achievements. William stopped caring. He'd learned something essential in these weeks. You can't logic someone out of racism if they didn't logic themselves into it. You could only show them and let reality do the teaching, and reality was teaching hard lessons to everyone who'd underestimated them. April 2nd. The rains came. Not the afternoon drizzles they'd grown used to, but torrential downpours that turned the jungle into a vertical river. Visibility dropped to arm's length, the trenches filled with water. Everything was soaked, rotting, falling apart. William sat in a foxhole with water up to his knees, trying to keep his rifle dry. Robinson was beside him, staring at nothing. They hadn't spoken in an hour. There was nothing to say. This was simply endurance now, not fighting, not advancing, just existing through another day of misery. "You remember Thompson," Robinson finally said. "Yeah. I've been having this dream. We're back on the ship playing cards and he's showing me that letter from his girl. But in the dream, I can see bullet holes in the letter. Blood on the pages. And I'm trying to tell him not to read it, that something bad is coming. But he can't hear me." Robinson's voice was flat, exhausted. "Then I wake up and remember he's dead. And I think, why him? Why not me?" "Survivor's guilt," William said. "Lee says everyone gets it. It's more than that. It's like I'm carrying all their deaths now. Thompson, Chen Morrison from 3rd Squad, Wallace, who stepped on that mine last week. All of them. And we're supposed to just keep going, keep fighting like they never existed, like their lives didn't mean anything." Williams turned to look at his friend. Robinson's face was gaunt, his eyes hollow. They'd all lost weight, all carried the same exhaustion. But this was different. This was something breaking. "They meant something," Williams said. "They mean something because we're still here, because we're doing what they would have done, carrying it forward." Carrying what? This war, this prove yourself bullshit. No, the promise that it matters, that all of this— Williams gestured at the jungle, the rain, the mud, that it adds up to something, that Sarah grows up in a different world because her daddy fought for it. Robinson was silent for a long moment. Then he pulled out the photograph, now water-stained and barely legible. "I can hardly see her face anymore. You know her face. Picture doesn't matter, doesn't it? What if I forget? What if I come home and I've forgotten what I was fighting for?" Williams didn't have an answer for that. He'd been in the jungle long enough now to understand what it did to you, how it stripped away everything that wasn't essential, how you became a creature of instinct and reflex, and the person you'd been before seemed like someone else entirely. The rain continued. They sat in their flooded foxhole, 2 men among thousands fighting a war that most of their country would never acknowledge. And somewhere in the darkness, enemy soldiers sat in their own holes, cold and wet and afraid, probably asking themselves the same questions. That night, the Japanese attacked. Not a probing raid, a full assault. Hundreds of men screaming "Banzai" and charging through the darkness with fixed bayonets. Williams had been dozing, hypothermic and exhausted, when the first explosions woke him. Grenades. Then rifle fire, so much of it that individual shots merged into one continuous roar. He grabbed his weapon, chambered around. Shadows poured through the jungle. He fired at them, couldn't tell if he hit anything. Beside him, Robinson was screaming, not in fear, but in rage, firing again and again. The muzzle flash lit his face in strobing bursts. A Japanese soldier materialized out of the darkness, bayonet raised. Williams shot him point blank. The man's momentum carried him forward. He collapsed across the foxhole's edge, his face inches from Williams. Their eyes met. The Japanese soldier was maybe 20 years old. He tried to say something, blood bubbling from his mouth, then died. Williams shoved the body away and kept firing. There was no thought anymore, no fear, no anything except the mechanical process of aiming and shooting. His training had taken over muscle memory and drilled responses. He'd become exactly what the army wanted, an efficient killing machine. The attack lasted 40 minutes. When it ended, the ground in front of their position was carpeted with bodies. 68 Japanese soldiers dead. The 93rd's casualties, 5 killed, 14 wounded. The math was brutal and clear. As dawn broke, Williams walked through the killing ground. He'd done this before, checking for wounded enemy, making sure the threat was eliminated. But this time felt different. The sheer number of bodies, the waste of it. Young men who'd charged into certain death because their commanders ordered it, because their culture demanded it, because surrendering was supposedly worse than dying. He found a Japanese officer still alive, gut-shot and fading. The man looked up at him and Williams saw recognition in his eyes. Not personal recognition. Recognition of what Williams was. A black soldier. One of the men his propaganda had mocked as cowards. The officer said something in Japanese. Williams didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. Respect. Acknowledgement. A warrior recognizing another warrior regardless of what ideology had told him to believe. Williams called for a medic. The officer died before help arrived. In his pocket, they found a letter to his family and a propaganda leaflet, one of the ones that had been dropped on American positions. The leaflet was folded worn, like he'd read it many times. Williams kept it. Added it to the collection Lee was building. Evidence of the lie they'd been told. Proof of the mistake that had cost so many lives. By mid-April, the Japanese had withdrawn further into the mountains. The 93rd controlled the coastal sectors, the river valleys, most of the island's infrastructure. The mission was succeeding beyond anyone's expectations. Anyone except the men doing the fighting who'd never doubted themselves in the first place. But exhaustion was setting in. 2 months of constant combat, of sleeping in mud, of watching friends die, of being perpetually wet and cold and hungry. The human body and mind can only endure so much before they start breaking down in ways that don't show on casualty reports. Williams noticed it in small ways. Robinson taking longer to respond to orders. Jackson staring at nothing for minutes at a time. Even Lee, unshakable Lee, seeming older somehow, moving slower. They were all grinding down, wearing away, becoming ghosts of whoever they'd been when they stepped off that transport ship. Yet they kept going. Not because they wanted to, not because they believed the cause was just, but because stopping meant letting down everyone who'd died, everyone who was counting on them, everyone back home who needed this to mean something. In his last letter before communications were disrupted by a storm, Robinson wrote to his wife, "I don't know if I'm coming home. Nobody does. But if I don't tell Sarah her daddy fought for something real, tell her we were told we couldn't and we did anyway. Tell her that matters." The letter never arrived. It sat in a mailbag at the beach depot for 3 weeks, got soaked in the monsoon, became unreadable. Just another casualty of war, not a life lost, but a connection. Severed words meant to bridge the gap between jungle hell and home, never finding their destination. But Robinson kept writing. They all did. Because even though the letters might not arrive, the act of writing them was a tether to humanity. A reminder that they were more than weapons, more than statistics, more than symbols in someone else's argument about racial capability. They were men. Scared, tired, traumatized men doing an impossible job under impossible circumstances. And somehow, despite everything they endured, not because they were superhuman, but because they were human, stubborn, and resilient, and determined to prove that courage had no color. The jungle kept teaching its lessons, and the 93rd kept passing every test with blood and bullets, and an unshakable refusal to be anything less than excellent. May brought a different kind of war. The Japanese stopped charging. They dug deeper, fought smarter, turned the jungle into a labyrinth of death that claimed men in ones and twos instead of dozens. Snipers, booby traps, ambushes so carefully planned they felt like murder rather than combat. Williams was on patrol when Martinez stepped on the mine. One moment the kid from El Paso was complaining about his boots, the next he was screaming his right leg gone below the knee. The blast echoed through the canopy. Birds exploded from the trees. Williams hit the ground, rifle ready, scanning for the follow-up attack that always came after a mine detonation. But nothing moved. Just Martinez screaming and the smell of burned flesh and explosive residue thick enough to taste. "Medic!" Robinson was already applying a tourniquet, his hands slick with blood. "Stay with me, Martinez. Look at me." Davis came running, his aid bag bouncing against his hip. He took one look at the wound and his face went blank, the expression medics got when they knew. Martinez was 19. He'd survive, but he'd never walk right again. He'd go home to El Paso with a purple heart and a limp, and questions about what it was worth. Williams helped load him onto a stretcher. Martinez gripped his hand, squeezing hard enough to hurt. "Did I do good, Sergeant? Did I do enough?" Williams wasn't a sergeant, but he didn't correct him. "You did perfect, brother. You did perfect." They carried Martinez back to the aid station through jungle that suddenly felt hostile in new ways. Every leaf could hide a tripwire. Every shadow could conceal a spider hole. The Japanese had adapted, learned from their losses, turned the terrain itself into a weapon. At the aid station, a tent with a red cross painted on canvas that offered no real protection, Williams watched them load Martinez onto a jeep for evacuation. The kid was in shock now, staring at nothing, his lips moving in silent prayer or conversation with someone who wasn't there. "That's the 15th this week," Davis said quietly. He was washing blood off his hands in a bucket of murky water. "Not from combat, from traps. They're bleeding us slow." "How many you saved?" "Most of them." "But saved for what?" "They go home broken, and back there nobody even knows what we did here." Davis dried his hands on a towel already stained brown. "My sister wrote me. Said there was another lynching in Mississippi last month. Returned soldier, still in uniform. They hung him from a bridge." Williams felt something cold settle in his stomach. "You sure?" She sent a newspaper clipping. Local paper called it racial tensions, like it was both sides fighting instead of murder. Davis threw the towel down. "We're over here dying for that, for a country that'll kill us for wearing the uniform we earned." "Then why you still here?" Davis looked at him, and Williams saw something raw and honest in his eyes. "Because if I go home now, if I quit, then that's all we are. Victims. But if I stay, if I keep saving lives, ours and theirs, then maybe I'm something else. Maybe I'm proof that we're better than what they think we are. You shouldn't have to prove that." "No. But here we are anyway." The conversation stayed with Williams as they pushed deeper into the interior. He'd joined up thinking that combat would be straightforward: kill the enemy, take ground, win the war. But nothing about this was straightforward. Every action carried weight beyond itself. Every success or failure became evidence in an argument that shouldn't exist. They were soldiers, but they were also symbols. And symbols couldn't afford to be human. May 12th. The patrol went out before dawn, 8 men moving through darkness so complete that Williams couldn't see his own hands. They were hunting a Japanese artillery position that had been shelling American positions for 3 days. Intelligence said it was mobile, moving after every firing sequence. Lee's squad had been tasked with finding it and calling in air support. They moved in single file, each man keeping a hand on the shoulder of the man ahead. Robinson was on point, navigating by instinct and occasional compass checks. Williams was fourth in line, every sense screaming as they pushed through vegetation that grabbed at their equipment and faces. 2 hours in, Robinson raised his fist. Everyone froze. Williams strained to hear anything over his own breathing. Their voices. Japanese. Close enough that he could hear individual words even if he couldn't understand them. Lee made hand signals, enemy ahead, prepare to engage. Williams's mouth went dry. His hands found familiar positions on his rifle without conscious thought. Training taking over, the body knowing what to do even when the mind was screaming. They crept forward. The voices grew clearer. Through a gap in the foliage, Williams saw them, a Japanese artillery crew servicing a 75mm field gun. Maybe 15 men relaxed, not expecting contact this deep in their territory. The gun was camouflaged with cut branches, positioned in a natural depression that made it invisible from the air. Lee checked his watch, made calculations. In 30 minutes, that gun would fire again. More shells on American positions, more casualties, more men like Martinez loaded onto jeeps, their futures demolished. "We can't take them all," Jackson whispered. "Not without backup." Lee was quiet, thinking. The smart play was to pull back radio coordinates, let the Air Corps handle it, but that would take hours. The gun would fire, displace, and they'd be hunting it again tomorrow. "Williams, Robinson, you're with me. We're going in close. Rest of you provide covering fire on my signal." Lee checked his weapon. "We eliminate the crew fast and hard, 30 seconds, then we're gone." "Sarge, that's suicide if anything goes wrong." "Then nothing goes wrong." Lee looked at each of them. "These men have been killing our brothers for 3 days. Now it's their turn." They split up. Williams circled left, moving so slowly that 10 yards took 5 minutes. Each footstep placed with absolute precision. His heart hammered so hard he was sure the enemy could hear it. Sweat ran into his eyes. A mosquito landed on his neck and he couldn't even brush it away. He got within 15 yards. Could see individual faces now. The Japanese gunners were young. Most looked 18, maybe 20. One was eating rice from a tin cup. Another was cleaning his rifle. They looked tired, scared, human. Williams pushed that thought away. They were enemy combatants. They'd been killing Americans. This was war, not murder. He repeated it like a mantra, trying to make himself believe it. Lee gave the signal 3 sharp whistles like a jungle bird. Williams opened fire. His first burst dropped 2 men. The artillery crew scattered, reaching for weapons. Jackson's bar opened up from the right, sweeping across the position. Lee threw grenades that exploded in mushrooms of dirt and smoke. The Japanese fought back. Bullets snapped past Williams's head. Something tugged at his sleeve, a round passing so close it tore fabric. He dove behind a tree, changed magazines, kept firing. The engagement lasted maybe 40 seconds. Then silence, except for ringing ears and someone moaning in Japanese. They'd killed 12. 3 escaped into the jungle. Lee checked the artillery piece, placed charges, and blew it sky high. The explosion would bring enemy reinforcements, so they ran sprinting through jungle that tore at their clothes and skin branches, whipping their faces, lungs burning. They made it back to American lines just as the pursuit arrived. The Japanese probe got chewed up by machine gun fire. Williams collapsed behind a sandbag wall, gasping his hands, shaking so hard he couldn't light a cigarette. "Good work," Lee said. His voice was steady, but his hands shook too. "We probably saved 20-30 American lives today." Williams wanted to feel good about that. Instead, he kept seeing the Japanese soldier eating rice the moment before the bullets hit. The way the man's face changed from boredom to shock to nothing. How young he'd been. "You all right?" Robinson sat down beside him. "Fine." "You're a terrible liar." Williams finally got his cigarette lit, inhaled smoke that made his head spin. "I keep thinking about their families. Somebody back in Japan is waiting for those men to come home. Somebody's daughter is waiting for her father, who I just killed while he was eating lunch. You want to talk about fair? My daughter's father might not come home because that man was trying to kill him first." Robinson's voice was hard. "This ain't about fair. This is about surviving. And if that means I gotta kill young men with families, then that's what it means. I made my peace with it." When did you make peace with it?" Robinson was quiet for a moment. "I didn't. I just decided to stop tearing myself apart over it. There's a difference." The admission hung between them. They were changing, all of them, becoming people they wouldn't recognize when they looked in mirrors back home. If they made it back home. By June, the 93rd had pushed the Japanese into the northern mountains, the most inhospitable terrain on the island. Supply lines were impossible. Every bullet, every ration had to be carried up slopes so steep that men used ropes to climb. The enemy defended every ridgeline, every cave system, every inch of ground, with a desperation born of knowing there was nowhere left to retreat to. June 8th. Williams's platoon was tasked with clearing a network of caves that intelligence said contained a Japanese command post. They approached at dawn, moving uphill through terrain that burned their legs and lungs. The cave entrance was a black mouth in the mountainside, exhaling air that smelled like decay and cordite. "I hate caves," Jackson muttered. "Can't see, can't maneuver, can't call for support." "Could be empty," someone offered without conviction. It wasn't empty. They'd advanced maybe 20 yards when machine gun fire erupted from the darkness. The muzzle flashes were blinding after the cave's blackness. Williams threw himself flat, firing blind, his bullets sparking off rock. Someone behind him was screaming. The sound echoed until he couldn't tell if it was one man or many. Fall back, Lee's voice barely audible over the gunfire. They retreated, dragging their wounded. Once outside, they counted casualties. 3 wounded, none critical. The cave system was a fortress. Taking it by assault would cost more men than it was worth. "We seal it," Lee decided. "Combat engineers can blow the entrance. Let them starve in there." But as they waited for the engineers, something happened that Williams would remember for the rest of his life. A white flag emerged from the cave, a dirty cloth tied to a stick, waving hesitantly. "Hold fire!" Lee shouted. They waited. A Japanese soldier emerged, gaunt, ragged, his uniform hanging off him like a scarecrow's clothes. He was unarmed. Behind him came others, 8 in total, hands, raised eyes, hollow with starvation. "What do we do?" Jackson asked. "Take them prisoner," Lee said. "That's the rules." But as they secured the Japanese soldiers, Williams saw the hatred in some of his squad's eyes. These men had just been shooting at them. These men were responsible for American deaths. It would be so easy to claim they'd tried to escape, that the shooting had been necessary. Lee saw it too. He positioned himself between the prisoners and his squad. "Anyone touches these men, you answer to me." They surrendered. That means they're protected. We don't become murderers just because war makes it convenient. The prisoners were evacuated under guard. Williams watched them go, seeing in their faces the same exhaustion and trauma he felt in himself. The Japanese propaganda had called them different species, Americans, civilized Japanese warriors, both superior to the colonized peoples they fought over. But strip away the uniforms and ideology, and they were the same scared young men trying to survive something that wanted to kill them. That night back at Camp, Williams wrote a letter he knew he'd never send. It was addressed to the mother of the Japanese soldier he'd killed, the one eating rice. He wrote in English she'd never read, but the act of writing mattered. "Your son died because I shot him. Not because he was evil, or because I'm good, but because we were told to kill each other by men who will never see this jungle. I'm sorry, not for defending my life, but for the waste of it all. For the fact that your grief is necessary for my survival. For the world that made this choice, the only choice." He burned the letter after writing it. The smoke rose and disappeared into the canopy. Robinson watched from across the fire. "You good?" "No, but I will be." Williams poked at the ashes. "Have to be, don't I?" The weeks ground on. Late June brought news from the outside world. The invasion of France, the liberation of Rome, the war in Europe turning toward inevitable victory. The white soldiers from other divisions would go home to parades and commemorations. The 93rd would stay here fighting in obscurity, their sacrifices footnoted or forgotten. July 4th, 1944. Independence Day. Someone had scrounged up cigarettes and beer. They sat around a fire, exhausted, dirty, trying to remember what they were celebrating. Freedom, democracy, rights. Abstract concepts that felt very far from this jungle where the only freedom that mattered was the freedom to survive another day. "My brother wrote me," Robinson said, breaking a long silence. "He's working in a munitions factory in Detroit, making good money union wages. He's asking when I'm coming home, like I got a choice." He laughed without humor. "I want to tell him I'm coming home when I'm allowed to come home. When the brass decides we've proven ourselves enough. When they run out of ways to test whether black men can fight. We've proven it already," Williams said. "The Japanese know. The Marines we relieved know. Everyone with eyes knows. Except the people who matter back home." It was true, and everyone knew it. The 93rd Infantry Division had fought for 4 months, inflicted devastating casualties on the enemy, held every position they'd been assigned, and exceeded every objective. The statistics were undeniable. Yet back stateside, the narrative remained unchanged. Black soldiers were experimental, questionable, not ready for frontline duty. The cognitive dissonance was maddening. They were good enough to die, but not good enough to be acknowledged. Effective enough to kill, but not credible enough to be believed. "You know what I realized?" Jackson spoke up. He was drunk, which was rare. "They don't want us to succeed, not really. Because if we succeed, it means they were wrong. About everything. About who we are, what we're capable of, how the world works. And they can't accept that. Better to ignore us, discredit us, pretend this never happened, than admit they built their whole society on a lie." The silence that followed was heavy. Jackson had said what they'd all been thinking, but hadn't articulated. This war wasn't just against the Japanese. It was against the narrative that said they couldn't fight, couldn't lead, couldn't be trusted with the responsibility of defending their nation. And they were winning both wars, but only one would ever be acknowledged. August came with rumors of reassignment. The 93rd had done its job. Bougainville was secure, the Japanese remnants contained in the northern mountains, where they posed no real threat. New divisions were arriving to garrison the island. The 93rd would move to other combat zones. Morotai, the Philippines, wherever black soldiers were needed, but not wanted. Williams's last patrol on Bougainville was August 15th. They were checking old battlefields, recovering equipment and personal effects from American dead. The jungle had already reclaimed most of the fighting positions. Vines grew through sandbag walls. Foxholes had filled with water and mud. In 6 months, no one would know battles had been fought here. They found a skeleton in a Japanese uniform still clutching a rifle. The body had been there since March, picked clean by animals and insects. Beside the skeleton was a leather wallet miraculously preserved. Inside was a photograph, a woman holding a baby. Williams stared at the photo for a long time. This soldier had been someone's husband, someone's father. He'd probably believed the propaganda about American racial inferiority. He'd probably died thinking he was fighting for his emperor and his homeland. But in the end, he'd just been another young man who'd believed what his superiors told him and paid for it with his life. "You gonna keep that?" Robinson asked. "No." Williams put the wallet back where he'd found it. Let him keep his family close. They marked the position for graves registration and moved on. Behind them, the jungle continued its slow consumption of war's evidence. In 50 years, maybe 100, no one would know what happened here. The blood would sink into the soil. The bones would turn to dust. The stories would be forgotten or distorted until they became myths that bore no resemblance to truth. But for now, in this moment, Williams and his brothers knew. They knew what they'd done and what it cost. They knew the fear and the exhaustion and the small acts of humanity that kept them from becoming the monsters war wanted them to be. They knew the truth that no propaganda could erase. They'd been called cowards, and they'd answered with 12,000 enemy dead. The numbers didn't lie. The Japanese had learned their lesson in blood. The only question was whether America would ever learn it too. As they walked back toward camp for the last time, Williams thought about Martinez with his missing leg. Thompson and Chen dead in the first firefight, the Japanese soldier eating rice who'd never finished his meal. He thought about Davis saving enemy lives, because his oath said all lives mattered, about Lee holding the line against both external and internal enemies, about Robinson fighting for a daughter who might not remember him. And he understood something fundamental: courage wasn't about being unafraid. It was about carrying fear and doubt and trauma and still doing what needed to be done. It was about fighting 2 wars at once and refusing to surrender either one. The 93rd Infantry Division would leave Bougainville having suffered 214 killed in action and 628 wounded. They would have eliminated over 3,000 confirmed enemy combatants, with estimated total casualties to Japanese forces exceeding 5,000. They would have never lost a position, never retreated without orders, never broken under pressure, and almost none of it would make it into the history books. But in the jungle, where truth was measured in blood and mud and endurance, they knew. And that would have to be enough. September 1944. The transport ship that carried them away from Bougainville smelled like disinfectant and diesel fuel. Williams stood on deck watching the island shrink behind them, green, turning to gray, turning to nothing. 4 months they'd fought there. 4 months of proving something that shouldn't have needed proof. Now they were heading to Morotai, another island, another jungle, another chance to bleed for people who still questioned whether they belonged. "You think it'll be different?" Robinson asked. He'd lost weight, they all had. His uniform hung loose. His eyes were hollowed out from too many nights on watch, too many days of killing. "No." "Then why are we doing it?" Williams didn't answer. There wasn't a good answer. They were doing it because orders said to do it, because stopping meant letting down everyone who'd died because the only way out was through. But mostly they were doing it because they'd become good at it, and that was its own kind of trap. The 93rd Division arrived at Morotai on September 15th. The island was supposed to be secured. The 31st Division had cleared most of it in a swift campaign. But secured in the Pacific meant the organized resistance had been broken, not that the killing had stopped. Japanese holdouts still controlled parts of the interior, small units, refusing to surrender, living off the land, conducting raids. The 93rd's mission was cleanup, search and destroy operations, hunt down the remnants and eliminate them. It sounded simple. It wasn't. The Japanese soldiers they faced here were different from those on Bougainville. These were the survivors, the hardest, the ones who'd watched their units get destroyed and kept fighting anyway. They knew they couldn't win. They weren't trying to win. They were trying to kill as many Americans as possible before they died, making their own deaths mean something in the only way left to them. October 3rd. Williams's squad was tracking a group of Japanese soldiers who'd ambushed a supply convoy, killed 2 drivers, and disappeared into the jungle. They'd been following signs for 3 days. Broken branches, footprints, cold fire pits. The enemy was moving fast, living off stolen rations, staying 1 step ahead. "They're leading us somewhere," Lee said quietly. He was studying the trail, his eyes narrowed. "This is too easy. They want us to follow." "Ambush." Jackson checked his bar, made sure the action was clear. "Maybe. Or maybe they're just exhausted and making mistakes." Lee stood up, wiped sweat from his face. "Either way, we keep moving, but tight formation, eyes open." They found the Japanese camp 2 hours later. 5 men, emaciated, their uniforms rotting off them. They had a small fire going, were cooking something that smelled like boiled leather. When Williams's squad approached, the Japanese soldiers didn't run. They stood up, picked up weapons that looked too heavy for their stick-thin arms, and opened fire. The firefight lasted maybe 20 seconds. The Japanese soldiers were too weak to aim properly, too malnourished to move fast. They died where they stood still, firing until the bullets stopped them. Williams walked through the camp after. Found a diary written in Japanese characters he couldn't read. Found photographs of families. Found a letter partially burned that someone had tried to destroy. These men had been starving, sick, probably suffering from malaria or dysentery or both. They could have surrendered. Instead, they'd chosen to fight to die on their terms rather than live as prisoners. Why? Robinson stood over one of the bodies. Why not just surrender? The war's already lost for them. Because surrendering meant betraying everything they were taught to believe, Lee said. Their whole culture, their whole identity is built on warrior honor. Surrender is worse than death. It's erasure. It's proving that everything they believed was wrong. He paused. Sound familiar? Williams understood. They were fighting men who'd been told their whole lives that surrender meant shame, that death was preferable to dishonor. The same way black soldiers had been told their whole lives that they were inferior, that they didn't belong, that they had to be twice as good to be considered half as worthy. Both groups were trapped by narratives that demanded they prove themselves through suffering. The difference was the Japanese soldiers were dying for their narrative. The 93rd was trying to destroy theirs. The operations continued through October. Swift, brutal engagements against enemies who wouldn't surrender. The 93rd killed 850 Japanese soldiers on Morotai in 3 months. The casualty ratio was even more lopsided than Bougainville. For every American killed, they accounted for nearly 20 enemy soldiers. But the numbers were abstract. What mattered was the accumulation of violence, the daily exposure to death, the slow erosion of whatever separated them from the killing machines the army wanted them to be. Williams saw it happening to Robinson first. His friend had always been thoughtful, careful, someone who questioned orders and thought about consequences. But after Morotai, something had changed. Robinson had stopped asking why. He just did what he was told efficiently and without emotion. His letters home became shorter, more generic. The photograph of his daughter stayed in his pocket, but he stopped taking it out. "You worried about him?" Jackson asked one night. They were on guard duty, sitting back-to-back in a foxhole, weapons across their laps. "Worried about all of us." "Yeah." Jackson lit a cigarette, cupping the flame so it wouldn't give away their position. "We're gonna go home different people, if we go home. You think we won't?" "I think the odds catch up with everyone eventually. We've been lucky so far, unlucky enough to be here, lucky enough to survive it. But luck runs out." Jackson took a long drag. "And even if our bodies make it home, I don't know if our minds will." Williams didn't argue. He'd been having dreams. Not nightmares exactly, but dreams where he was back home in Birmingham and couldn't stop seeing the world like a battlefield. Every shadow was a potential threat. Every sound was incoming fire. Every person was either friendly or hostile, no in between. In one dream, he'd been at a church picnic and someone had dropped a plate. The sound made him dive for cover, reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. Everyone stared at him like he was crazy. Maybe he was. Maybe they all were. Maybe sanity was the first casualty of war and everything after was just different degrees of functional madness. November brought orders for their next deployment, Luzon, the largest island in the Philippines. MacArthur was making his return, fulfilling his promise, and he needed every available unit. The 93rd would be part of the invasion force landing at Lingayen Gulf in January 1945. They trained for amphibious assault, practiced beach landings on Moratai's shores. The training felt surreal after months of jungle warfare, going back to basics, rehearsing movements they'd done a year ago before Bougainville. But the stakes were higher now. Luzon wasn't some isolated island. It was a major Japanese stronghold with over 250,000 troops defending it. "We're going to take heavy casualties," Lee told his squad during a briefing. "Luzon makes Bougainville look like a training exercise. The Japanese have had years to fortify it. They've got artillery armor, prepared positions, and they're not going to retreat. They'll fight for every inch." "Good," Robinson said flatly. "Let them fight. We'll kill them all the same." Lee looked at him for a long moment. "Robinson, you need to take some time. Talk to the chaplain." "I'm fine, Sergeant." "No, you're not. None of us are. But you're starting to scare me. And I've seen a lot of scared men do stupid things that get themselves and others killed." Robinson met his eyes. "Sir, I appreciate your concern, but I'm fine. I'm focused. And when we hit that beach, I'll do my job. That's all that matters." After the briefing, Williams pulled Robinson aside. "Talk to me." "Nothing to talk about. You're not fine. Lee's right. You're not the same person who got on that transport ship a year ago." Robinson's laugh was harsh. "You want me to be that person? That naive kid who thought this war meant something, who believed we were fighting for freedom and justice and all that bullshit they taught us in school?" He shook his head. "That person's dead. He died on Bougainville. Maybe in that first firefight, maybe slowly over the months. But he's gone. What's left is what you see, a soldier who kills the enemy and tries not to think about it. That's not all you are, isn't it? What else is there? I read Sarah's letters and I can barely remember who she is. My wife writes about her day and it sounds like she's describing a different planet. Home isn't real anymore. This is real. The killing, the fear, the exhaustion. Everything else is just noise." Williams wanted to argue, to tell Robinson he was wrong, that home was real, and they'd get back to it and things would be normal again. But he couldn't make himself believe it enough to say it convincingly. They hit the beaches of Lingayen Gulf on January 9, 1945. The landing was chaos artillery fire churning the water, machine guns cutting through the air, men falling before they even reached the sand. Williams waded through chest-deep water that turned red around him. Someone to his left took a round through the head and dropped without a sound. Someone else was screaming for a medic, his guts spilling into the surf. Williams made it to the beach dove behind a wrecked landing craft, returned fire at muzzle flashes he could barely see through the smoke. Beside him, Jackson was firing the Bear in controlled bursts, the heavy weapon punching through Japanese positions. Robinson was already moving forward, not even taking cover, walking through enemy fire like he was invincible or didn't care which. Robinson. "Get down!" Lee was screaming at him. Robinson didn't get down. He kept walking, kept firing, and somehow nothing hit him. He reached a bunker, threw in a grenade, moved to the next one. The Japanese defenders broke, retreated inland. Robinson followed them, and the squad had no choice but to follow Robinson. They cleared 300 yards of beach in 20 minutes. The cost was high. Their platoon took 30% casualties in the landing alone. But they'd secured their objective. The 93rd had its foothold on Luzon. The push inland was grinding. The Japanese defense was layered, organized, supported by artillery that was accurate and deadly. Every village was a fortress. Every rice paddy was a killing ground. The 93rd advanced yard by yard, paying in blood for every gain. February brought the battle for the Villa Verde Trail, a narrow road through the Sierra Madre Mountains that the Japanese had turned into a death trap. Bunkers carved into hillsides, machine guns covering every approach, mortars zeroed in on every piece of cover. The 93rd spent 2 weeks fighting up that trail, losing men every day, gaining maybe a few hundred yards at a time. Williams was hit on February 18th. Not a killing shot, shrapnel from a mortar round that tore through his left arm. He felt the impact before he felt the pain, like someone had punched him hard. Then the pain arrived, white hot and nauseating. He dropped behind cover, trying to apply pressure with his right hand while blood poured through his fingers. Davis appeared, his face grim. "Let me see it." "I'm fine. There's others worse than me." "Shut up and let me see it." Davis cut away the sleeve, examined the wound. "You're lucky. Missed the bone, missed the major vessels. You'll keep the arm." "That's lucky." "On this trail?" "Yeah." Davis bandaged it tight, gave him morphine that made the edges of everything soft. "You're going back to the aid station. This is your ticket out." "I'm not leaving my squad." "You don't have a choice. You're combat ineffective. You go back, you heal up, maybe you come back in a few weeks. Or maybe the war ends and you go home." Davis gripped his shoulder. "Take the win, Williams. You've done enough." But Williams couldn't shake the feeling that leaving was abandoning his brothers. He thought about Thompson and Chen, who'd never had the choice. He thought about Martinez with his missing leg. He thought about all the men still fighting up that trail while he got evacuated to safety. At the aid station, he ran into Martinez. The kid from El Paso was working as a clerk, processing casualty reports, his wooden crutch leaning against the desk. "Williams heard you took one." "Not as bad as yours." "No. Mine got me sent home." Martinez gestured at his missing leg. "Purple Heart medical discharge and a lifetime of people not knowing what to say to me." "You made it out, though. That's something." "Is it?" Martinez's smile was bitter. "I got off that island. But you know what? I can't get off. The memory of it. Every night I'm back there, and every morning I wake up and my leg is still gone." He paused. "The body comes home. The mind stays in the jungle. Nobody tells you that part." Williams spent 3 weeks recovering. His arm healed slowly, the wound infection requiring antibiotics and careful monitoring. He read letters from home that felt like they were written to someone else. His mother talked about church socials and neighborhood gossip. His sister wrote about a job she'd gotten at a department store, how they made her use the colored entrance and wouldn't let her try on clothes before buying them. The disconnect was dizzying. He was healing from combat wounds in the Philippines while his sister was fighting for the right to try on a dress in Alabama. Both were real. Both mattered. But they existed in different universes that couldn't quite touch each other. When he returned to his unit in mid-March, Robinson was gone. Not killed, transferred. Lee explained it quietly away from the others. He went full berserker during an assault, charged a Japanese position alone, killed 8 men, took the position by himself. Probably saved lives, the position was cutting us to pieces. But the way he did it, Lee shook his head. Command pulled him out, said he was displaying signs of combat fatigue. He's in a rear area getting evaluated. He gonna be okay? I don't know. The mind breaks different ways for different people. Some men break loud, screaming, crying, can't function. Robinson broke quiet. He became too good at killing, and that's almost worse. Williams understood. The Army wanted soldiers who could kill efficiently. But if you became too efficient, if you started to like it or didn't care about it anymore, then you'd crossed a line into something the Army couldn't control. You became dangerous to everyone, not just the enemy. The 93rd pushed deeper into Luzon through March and April. They cleared Japanese positions in the mountains, fought through fortified villages, eliminated strong points that had held up the American advance for weeks. The statistics continued to accumulate: 4,000 more confirmed enemy kills, thousands more probable. American casualties climbed to another 100, dead 300 wounded. By May, the Japanese defense was collapsing, not surrendering, collapsing. Their supply lines were cut, their units isolated, their command structure broken. But they kept fighting anyway, small groups of soldiers who'd fight to the last man rather than lay down their weapons. May 7th, 1945. Williams's squad was clearing a village when they found the bodies. 12 Japanese soldiers who'd committed suicide rather than surrender. They'd gathered in a small house, shared a last meal, then killed themselves with grenades. The blood was still fresh. The rice in their bowls was still warm. Why? Jackson asked the question they were all thinking. The war's over. Everyone knows it's over. Why die for nothing? Because it's not nothing to them, Lee said quietly. It's everything. Their honor, their duty, their whole identity. We're asking them to give up who they are. Some people can't do that, won't do that, even when the alternative is death. Williams thought about that as they cleared the rest of the village. Thought about how everyone was trapped by the stories they told themselves about who they were supposed to be. The Japanese were trapped by Bushido. Black soldiers were trapped by the need to prove themselves. White America was trapped by its racist mythology. Everyone in this war was fighting for narratives as much as territory. And the narratives demanded blood. Always more blood. Never enough blood to finally satisfy them. The news of Germany's surrender reached them on May 8th, VE Day, victory in Europe. The white divisions would be going home soon, back to parades and celebrations and grateful nations. The 93rd would stay in the Pacific, mopping up the last resistance, fighting a war that was already won, but wouldn't stop killing. When do we go home? Someone asked during mail call. Nobody had an answer. The Army needed bodies to occupy Japan, to garrison bases, to maintain order in the aftermath. The 93rd would be useful for that. They could fight, they could die, but they couldn't be trusted with the glory of victory. The fighting continued through June and into July. Small engagements, ambushes, the grinding work of eliminating holdouts who refused to accept reality. Then, on August 6th, everything changed. A single bomb. Hiroshima. A city erased. The numbers were too large to comprehend. 70,000 dead, instantly, maybe more. 3 days later, another bomb. Nagasaki. Another city gone. On August 15th, the Emperor's voice crackled over radios announcing surrender. The war was over. Japan had capitulated. After 6 years of global carnage, the killing would finally stop. Williams heard the news in a foxhole on guard duty in the middle of the night. He didn't feel anything at first. Not joy, not relief. Just a kind of numb acknowledgement. They'd survived. Against all odds, through Bougainville and Morotai and Luzon, through a year and a half of combat, they'd survived. But survival had costs that wouldn't show up in casualty reports. They'd lost pieces of themselves in those jungles parts that would never grow back. They'd learned to kill without thinking about it, to see human beings as targets, to function in hell like it was normal. And now they were supposed to turn that off, go home, pretend they were the same people who'd left. Lee gathered the squad the next morning. His face showed every one of his 40-plus years. It's over. We won. The 93rd Infantry Division fought for 18 months in the Pacific Theater. We eliminated over 12,000 enemy combatants. We never lost a position. We never retreated. We never broke. He paused. A lot of men didn't make it. Thompson Chen Martinez in a way, Robinson in another way. Hundreds more whose names we'll forget because forgetting is the only way to keep carrying the weight of remembering. What happens now, Sergeant? Williams asked. Now we go home. To a country that still doesn't believe we did what we did. To newspapers that won't cover our story. To parades we won't be invited to. We go home and try to figure out how to be human again after 18 months of being weapons. Lee looked at each of them, and we remember. We remember what we proved even if nobody else does. We were told we were inferior, and we answered with blood and steel and unwavering courage. That's our truth. Nobody can take that from us. They stayed in the Philippines for another 3 months waiting for transport home. The 93rd was low-priority combat units got rotated out first, and despite everything they'd done, the 93rd wasn't considered a priority combat unit. They were an experiment, and now that the war was over, nobody quite knew what to do with the results. William spent those months trying to reconnect with the person he'd been before the war. He wrote long letters home trying to explain what he'd experienced, but the words felt inadequate, hollow. How do you describe the smell of death to someone who's never smelled it? How do you explain what it's like to kill a man to someone who's never held that weight? He gave up trying to explain and just wrote about practical things when he'd be home. What he wanted to do. How he was looking forward to sleeping in a real bed, eating real food, not constantly scanning for threats. But he knew it was a lie. Part of him would always be scanning for threats. Part of him would always be in that jungle weapon, ready waiting for the next attack. They finally boarded a transport ship in early November 1945. The journey home took 3 weeks. Williams stood on deck as America came into view, the California coastline emerging from morning fog. He'd been gone 20 months. He'd left as a boy, trying to prove something. He was returning as something else entirely. There was no parade waiting at the dock. No brass band, no politicians making speeches, no grateful civilians waving flags. There was a processing station paperwork, a bus to the train station. The 93rd Infantry Division was quietly disbanded. The men were given their discharges and sent home with instructions to return their equipment and report to their local draft boards. Freedom had come, not the triumphant liberation they'd imagined, but a quiet, anticlimactic dispersal. They'd proven everything and been acknowledged for nothing. As Williams boarded the train to Alabama, he thought about the Japanese soldiers who died rather than surrender their identity. He thought about Robinson, who'd broken trying to prove his. He thought about all the men, American and Japanese, who'd been sacrificed to narratives that demanded they suffer to validate their existence. The war was over. But the battle to be recognized, to be valued, to be treated as equal, that war was just beginning. And it would be fought not with rifles and grenades, but with patience and persistence, and the quiet refusal to accept less than full humanity. The train pulled away from the station. Williams watched the base disappear behind him, taking with it the last 18 months of his life. He was going home. But home would never feel the same. The jungle had taught him too much about what humans could do to each other. And America had taught him that proving yourself meant nothing if people were determined not to see it. He closed his eyes and tried to sleep. But even in sleep, he was still on guard duty, still waiting for the attack that never quite stopped coming. The train crossed into Alabama on a cold November morning. Williams pressed his face against the window, watching farmland roll past cotton fields stripped bare after harvest farmhouses, with smoke rising from chimneys, a world that looked exactly as he'd left it. But everything had changed. Or maybe he had, and the world's refusal to change was what made it feel so alien. Birmingham's Union Station smelled like coal smoke and coffee. Williams stepped onto the platform with his duffel bag and discharge papers, scanning the crowd for his mother's face. He found her near the colored waiting room, smaller than he remembered, her hair grayer. When their eyes met, something broke in her expression, relief and grief tangled together. She held him for a long time, not speaking. Her hands shook against his back. When she finally pulled away, she touched his face like she was checking to make sure he was real. "You're thinner," she said. "Yeah. We gonna fix that." She picked up his bag, started walking toward the exit. Then she stopped, turned back. "Your sister wanted to come, but she's working. They only give her Sundays off." "That's okay, Mama." They walked through streets Williams had known his whole life. Nothing had changed. Same buildings, same people, same invisible lines that divided white Birmingham from black Birmingham. But he'd changed. He'd commanded men in combat, made life or death decisions, earned the respect of soldiers who'd started out doubting him. Now he was back to stepping off sidewalks when white people approached, back to using colored entrances, back to being less than. At home, his mother made him sit while she cooked. She asked questions carefully, like she was afraid of the answers. How was the food? Did he stay warm? Did he make friends? She didn't ask about the fighting, about the dying, about what 18 months in hell had done to him. Maybe she didn't want to know. Maybe she already knew and was trying to preserve the fiction that he could still be her boy, untouched by war. His sister came home after dark, still wearing her department store uniform. She hugged him hard, then stepped back and studied his face. "You look different." "I am different." "Good different or bad different?" Williams didn't answer. She nodded like she understood. That night, lying in his childhood bed, Williams couldn't sleep. The mattress was too soft. The silence was too complete. He kept waiting for the sound of mortar fire, for Lee's voice calling watch rotations, for the jungle's thousand small noises. When he finally slept, he dreamed of Bougainville, but in the dream he was walking through Birmingham, and everyone he passed was dead, their bodies rotting in the Alabama heat, and nobody seemed to notice except him. He woke up gasping, his shirt soaked with sweat. His mother was in the doorway, backlit by the hallway light. "You were screaming," she said softly. "I'm okay." "No, you're not." She came in, sat on the edge of his bed like she used to when he was sick as a child. "But you will be. You're home now. You're safe." Safe. The word felt meaningless. He'd survived the war only to come back to a place where a white mob could lynch him for looking at someone wrong, where the police would investigate and find nothing, where the newspapers would call it racial tensions instead of murder. Davis's sister had written about a soldier hung from a bridge while still in uniform. That man had been safe too, right up until he wasn't. The next morning, Williams walked downtown to the VA office. The waiting room was segregated whites on one side, coloreds on the other. A white veteran who couldn't have been more than 20 sat across from him, missing his left arm. Their eyes met. Williams wondered if he'd been in Europe, if he'd faced the Germans the way Williams had faced the Japanese. The kid looked away first. Williams filled out paperwork for benefits he probably wouldn't receive, answered questions from a clerk who seemed annoyed by his presence. The GI Bill was supposed to help veterans get education, buy homes, start businesses. But in Alabama, most colleges wouldn't accept black students. Most banks wouldn't give black veterans loans, and most businesses wouldn't hire them for anything better than manual labor. "Next," the clerk called, not looking up. Williams gathered his papers and left. On the street outside, he ran into Lee. His former sergeant was wearing civilian clothes that hung wrong on him, like he hadn't quite figured out how to inhabit them yet. "Williams." Lee gripped his hand, pulled him into a brief hug. "When'd you get back?" "Yesterday. 3 weeks ago." Lee's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Been trying to find work. Turns out 20 years in the Army don't qualify you for much when you're colored." They walked together, not really going anywhere, just moving because standing still felt wrong after so many months on patrol. Lee talked about the other men from their unit. Jackson was in Chicago, supposedly doing okay. Robinson was in a hospital, not for his wounds, for his mind. The doctors called it combat fatigue, battle fatigue, shell shock. Whatever name they gave, it didn't change what it was. Robinson had broken under the weight of proving himself, and now he was trying to remember how to be human again. "I'm thinking about organizing," Lee said suddenly. "The men from the 93rd, other black veterans, we proved something over there. We can't just let them forget about it. They're going to forget anyway. They don't want to remember. Then we make them remember. We write letters, we give speeches, we demand the recognition we earned. Lee stopped walking, turned to face Williams. "We didn't survive that hell just to come home and accept less than what we're worth." Williams wanted to believe him. Wanted to think that their service mattered, that the 12,000 enemy dead and the blood they'd spilled would add up to something. But he'd been home less than 2 days, and already the weight of invisibility was crushing him. "I'm tired, Sarge. I'm so goddamn tired." Lee gripped his shoulder. "I know, we all are. But tired is what they want us to be. Tired means we give up. We accept our place. We let them win without even fighting." His eyes were fierce. "We fought one war already. This next one's going to be longer and harder, but it's the one that actually matters. The one for our kids and grandkids. So they don't have to prove the same shit we proved." They parted ways at the bus stop. Lee went north. Williams went south, back to the colored section where he belonged. On the bus, he sat in the back, as required by law, staring out at a city that hadn't changed while he'd been gone. He'd killed for this place. He'd watched friends die for it. And it still wouldn't let him sit in the front of a bus. Christmas came. Williams tried to be present for his family, tried to smile at the right times, tried to pretend everything was normal. But normal was gone. His mother served a meal that would have seemed like a feast in the jungle, ham and sweet potatoes and cornbread, but he could barely taste it. His sister talked about her job, about a boy who was courting her, about neighborhood gossip that should have interested him and didn't. "Marcus, you listening?" his mother asked. "Sorry, Mama. My mind was somewhere else. It's been somewhere else since you got back." She set down her fork. "You can talk to us. Whatever you saw over there, whatever you did, we're your family. We can handle it." But they couldn't. How could he explain what it felt like to shoot a man who was just trying to eat his lunch? How could he describe the sound Martinez made when the mine took his leg? How could he make them understand that part of him was still in that jungle, would always be in that jungle, and the person sitting at this table was just a shell going through the motions? "I'm fine, Mama. Just adjusting." His sister caught his eye across the table. She knew he was lying, but she didn't push. January 1946. Williams got a job at a steel mill, the same one where his father had worked before dying in an accident 10 years earlier. The work was hard 12-hour shifts and heat that made the jungle seem cool by comparison. But it was something to do, somewhere to be, a way to exhaust his body so his mind might finally rest. He worked alongside other black men, some of them veterans too. They didn't talk much about the war. What was there to say? They'd gone, they'd fought, they'd come home to the same discrimination they'd left. The white workers got promoted, got the easier assignments, got paid more for the same work. The black workers got the dangerous jobs, the ones that broke bodies and shortened lives. One day in February, a white foreman started yelling at an older black worker named Johnson. The man had been too slow, had made a mistake, had somehow failed to meet the impossible standards they were held to. The foreman's face was red, his voice loud enough to carry over the machinery. "You people are all the same, lazy, stupid, can't follow simple instructions." Something in Williams snapped. He walked over, stood between the foreman and Johnson. "That's enough." The foreman's eyes widened. "What did you say to me, boy?" "I said that's enough. Mr. Johnson made a mistake. It happens. You don't need to talk to him like that. I'll talk to him however I want. And you just earned yourself a suspension. Get off my floor." Williams didn't move. Around them, work had stopped. Other men were watching, black and white, everyone waiting to see what happened next. "I spent 18 months in the Pacific," Williams said quietly. "Fought for this country, killed for it, watched my friends die for it, and I'm not going to stand here and let you disrespect a man for the crime of being tired and making a mistake. I don't care where you fought. This is my floor, and it's your floor." Williams stepped closer. "This is America, the country I supposedly fought to defend. And if I can't stand up to bullies here, then what the hell did I fight for over there?" The foreman's hand went to his belt, maybe for a weapon, maybe just out of habit. Williams's body reacted before his mind caught up. He grabbed the man's wrist, twisted it, put him on the ground in a move he'd learned in hand-to-hand combat training. The foreman hit the concrete floor hard, the wind knocked out of him. Silence. Complete and total silence except for the hum of machinery. Williams let go, stepped back. He'd just assaulted a white man in Alabama in 1946. He might as well have signed his own death warrant. "I quit," he said to no one in particular. Then he walked out expecting to hear police sirens before he made it home. But nothing happened. The foreman was too embarrassed to report that a black man had taken him down. Or maybe he was scared of what might happen if other veterans heard the story and got ideas. Either way, Williams was unemployed but not arrested. It felt like the smallest of victories. Lee heard about the incident within days. He showed up at Williams's house with newspapers and pamphlets. "This," he said, spreading them across the kitchen table, "is what I've been telling you about. The NAACP is organizing. Black veterans are speaking out. Things are starting to change." Williams looked at the headlines. A lynching in Georgia, a riot in Tennessee, another black veteran beaten by police for trying to vote. Don't look like change to me. That's because you're looking at the immediate. I'm talking about the long arc. We're planting seeds. Lee tapped one of the pamphlets. "There's a meeting next week. Veterans talking about organizing, demanding our rights. You should come." "What's the point?" "The point is we didn't fight that war for nothing. The point is we proved we're men and now we're going to make America acknowledge it." Lee leaned forward. "Listen to me. The Japanese learned their lesson. They underestimated us and it cost them 12,000 men. Now it's America's turn to learn. And we're going to teach them the same way by refusing to back down, by being so undeniably excellent. They can't ignore us by fighting until they've got no choice but to see us as equals." Williams wanted to believe him, but belief required energy he didn't have. The meeting happened in a church basement. 40 men, all veterans, all black, all carrying the same weight of having proven themselves to everyone except the people who mattered. Lee stood at the front speaking with the authority of a man who'd commanded soldiers in combat. "We fought for freedom abroad. Now we fight for it at home. We use our GI Bill benefits, and when they deny us, we sue. We register to vote, and when they try to stop us, we persist. We apply for jobs we're qualified for, and when they reject us, we make noise about it." Lee looked around the room. "They want us to go quietly back to our place. But we don't have a place anymore except the one we make for ourselves." A man in the back raised his hand. "And when they lynch us for getting uppity when the Klan shows up, when the police look the other way, then we die on our feet instead of living on our knees." Lee's voice was steel. "I'm not saying it won't cost us. It will. Some of us might not survive this fight, but our children will. Our grandchildren will. And they'll grow up in a world where what we did over there actually meant something." Williams listened to the others talk, men sharing stories of discrimination, of benefits denied, of promises broken. One man had been accepted to college only to have the offer rescinded when he showed up and they saw his skin. Another had been turned away from a hospital when his son was sick, told to go to the colored clinic 20 miles away. By the time they got there, the boy had died. The stories piled up like bodies on a battlefield, evidence of a different kind of war, one where the casualties didn't always make headlines, but died just the same. After the meeting, Williams stayed to talk with Lee. "You really think we can win this? We already won once, against an enemy that called us inferior and learned better. We'll win again." Lee paused. "But it won't be in our lifetime. This is a long war, Williams. Decades, maybe. We're just the first wave softening the defenses for the ones who come after." Williams thought about Sarah Robinson's daughter who'd be growing up without her father while he recovered in a hospital trying to remember how to be human. He thought about his own future children if he ever had any. What kind of world would they inherit? "I'm in," he said. "Whatever it takes, I'm in." The years that followed were hard. Williams worked various jobs, none of them good, all of them beneath his capabilities. He organized with Lee and other veterans, pushing for voting rights, for equal employment, for basic human dignity. Progress was measured in inches when they needed miles. In 1948, President Truman desegregated the military. It was a small victory acknowledgement that black soldiers could fight something the 93rd had proven 3 years earlier, at the cost of blood and trauma. Better late than never, but the lateness stung. Williams married in 1950, had a daughter in 1952. He named her Hope because he needed to believe that was still possible. He told her stories about the war-sanitized versions that left out the worst parts. He wanted her to know that her father had fought, had served, had proven himself. But he also wanted to protect her from the weight of it, from understanding how much proving yourself cost, when you shouldn't have had to prove anything at all. The 1950s brought the beginning of the civil rights movement. Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat. Montgomery bus boycott. Brown versus Board of Education. The seeds Lee had talked about were starting to grow, pushing through concrete, refusing to stay buried. Williams marched with Lee in Birmingham in 1963. They walked down streets they'd known their whole lives, facing fire hoses and police dogs and white people screaming hatred. Williams was 51 years old, his hair gray, his body carrying injuries from the war and decades of hard labor. But he marched because Lee had been right. They'd fought one war for freedom, and now they were fighting another. During one protest, a white officer shoved Lee hard. The old sergeant stumbled, nearly fell. Williams caught him, helped him steady. Their eyes met, and for a moment they were back in the jungle, looking out for each other, refusing to let their brothers fall. "We're winning," Lee said through split lips. Blood ran down his chin. "Can you feel it? We're finally winning." Williams could feel it. The ground was shifting. Not fast enough, never fast enough, but moving nonetheless. Lee died in 1965, 3 weeks after the Voting Rights Act passed. Heart attack, sudden and complete. Williams spoke at his funeral, looking out at a church full of veterans who'd served with them, young activists who'd never known the war, but were fighting its continuation at home. "Sergeant Thomas Lee told me once that we were planting seeds," Williams said, "that we'd fought in the Pacific to prove something, and now we had to fight at home to make that proof matter." He was right. And now some of those seeds are trees, strong enough to provide shelter for the generations coming up behind us. Williams kept fighting through the 1970s and into the 1980s. He watched his daughter graduate college, something that wouldn't have been possible without the battles they'd fought. He watched the country slowly, painfully acknowledge that Black Americans were fully human, deserving of rights and dignity. But the 93rd Infantry Division remained largely forgotten. No major films about their service. No best-selling books. No chapter in most history textbooks. They'd killed 12,000 enemy soldiers and proved beyond any doubt that courage had no color. And America had collectively shrugged and moved on. In 1992, Williams received a letter from a historian researching the 93rd Division. Would he be willing to be interviewed about his service? Williams was 70 years old, his body failing, his mind still sharp enough to remember everything he'd tried for decades to forget. He agreed. The interview happened in his living room, his daughter present, a recording device capturing every word. Williams talked for hours about Fort Huachuca, about the propaganda leaflets about Bougainville and Morotai and Luzon. He talked about Thompson and Chen and Martinez and Robinson. He talked about Davis saving enemy lives because his oath said all lives mattered. He talked about Lee holding the line against hatred from both sides. "What do you want people to know?" the historian asked. Williams was quiet for a long moment. "I want them to know we were there, that we fought, that we proved everything they said we couldn't prove. I want my granddaughter." He gestured to where she sat, 16 years old, taking notes. "I want her to know that her grandfather and men like him earned her freedom twice. Once from the Japanese who called us inferior, once from the Americans who agreed with them. Do you think your service mattered? It mattered to the 12,000 enemy soldiers who died learning we weren't cowards. It mattered to the white soldiers we fought beside who saw us as equals. It mattered to us because we know what we did regardless of who remembers." Williams paused. "But did it change America the way we hoped? No. Not fast enough. Not completely. We planted seeds, like Lee said. Some grew, some didn't. But we planted them anyway because that's what soldiers do. We hold the line even when it seems hopeless." The interview was included in a small academic book that almost nobody read. The 93rd remained footnoted, their story known to specialists, but absent from popular understanding of the war. Williams died in 1998, 76 years old, his body finally giving out after decades of carrying weight it was never meant to carry. His funeral was small family, a few surviving members of his unit, younger veterans from later wars who'd heard his stories and understood they were part of a longer struggle. His granddaughter spoke, her voice steady despite tears. My grandfather told me once that the war taught him something important. You can't make people see you as human if they've decided you're not. But you can make them acknowledge you. You can force recognition through undeniable excellence. And you can pass that knowledge to the next generation so they don't have to prove the same things all over again. She held up a propaganda leaflet, one of the originals yellowed and brittle that Williams had kept for 53 years. The Japanese dropped these on American positions. They called my grandfather and men like him cowards. They were wrong. 12,000 dead enemy soldiers proved they were wrong. And my grandfather wanted me to remember that whenever someone tells me I can't do something because of who I am, the answer isn't to argue. It's to do it anyway. To be so excellent, they can't ignore you. To prove them wrong and make them count their dead assumptions. It would take until 2022, 77 years after the war ended, for the 93rd Infantry Division to receive the Congressional Gold Medal, America's highest civilian honor. Most of the men who'd served were dead. Their children were old. Their grandchildren accepted the medal on their behalf. The ceremony was brief, official, the kind of recognition that comes too late to matter to the people who earned it. But it mattered to their descendants. It mattered to the historical record. It mattered because even delayed acknowledgement is better than eternal silence. The medal sits now in the Smithsonian, next to a display about the 93rd Infantry Division. Visitors can read about Bougainville, Morotai, Luzon. They can see photographs of young black men in uniform weapons, ready eyes tired but unbroken. They can read the statistics: 12,000 enemy casualties, combat effectiveness that exceeded most white units, a proving ground for capabilities that should never have needed proving. But statistics don't capture what it cost. The trauma that men like Robinson carried until it broke them. The quiet desperation of coming home to a country that still considered you less than. The decades of fighting for recognition that should have been automatic. The seed planting that Lee talked about, where you fight not for yourself, but for grandchildren you might never meet. The 93rd Infantry Division proved that courage has no color. They proved it with blood and steel and unwavering determination. They proved it while fighting two wars simultaneously, one against an external enemy, one against the internal prejudice that questioned their very humanity. They proved it knowing that proof might never be acknowledged. And they proved it anyway, because that's what soldiers do. They hold the line. They fight for principles that their nation claims but doesn't always honor. They plant seeds in bloody soil and hope something good will grow from the sacrifice. Williams knew he wouldn't live to see full equality. Lee died before seeing the Voting Rights Act's impact. Most of the 93rd died before their service was formally recognized. But their granddaughters live in a different world. Not a perfect world. Racism didn't die with the World War II generation. But a world where a black soldier's courage isn't questioned, where combat effectiveness isn't determined by skin color, where the Japanese propaganda leaflets calling black soldiers inferior would be laughable instead of reflecting official American policy. That world exists because men like Williams and Lee and Robinson refused to accept less than their full humanity, because they fought, suffered, and in some cases died to prove something that should have been self-evident. The jungle of Bougainville has long since reclaimed the battlefields. The foxholes have filled in. The blood has sunk into the soil. Nature has erased the physical evidence of the 93rd's war, but the memory remains. In family stories passed down through generations. In the historical record that's slowly finally acknowledging their service. In the example they set for every black soldier who came after fighting not just enemy forces, but the presumption of inferiority. They were told they were cowards. They answered with 12,000 enemy dead. They were told they couldn't fight. They answered by never losing a position. They were told they were inferior. They answered by being undeniably excellent. And though recognition came 77 years late, though most of them died without acknowledgement, though the nation they bled for took decades to even notice their truth, remains unshakable. Courage has no color. Valor knows no race. And the price of proving what should be obvious is paid in blood and trauma and generational struggle that echoes long after the shooting stops. If you believe their names deserve to be remembered, share this story. Write a name in the comments. Williams Lee Robinson, Thompson, Chen Martinez, Davis, Jackson. Men who fought for a country that questioned their humanity and proved over and over that the question itself was the crime. They earned their place in history. It just took history 77 years to notice.